Good evening, everybody. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the regular meeting of the Larkspur City Council. I would like to get us started. It's 6:30 on January the 18th. And could we please get a roll call?
Councilmember Carroll,
Here.
Councilmember Hara,
I'm here, thanks.
Councilmember Way.
Here.
Vice Mayor Kandel,
I am here.
Mayor Paulson.
Here. And let's start off our meeting with the Pledge of Allegiance. Whoever's able, please rise.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. So let's move to agenda item number 2, which is public comment. And as always, public comment is for matters that are not on the agenda and also that won't be covered in the consent calendar. It's 3 minutes for individuals, 5 for people representing a group. If you'd like, please go to the podium and let us know who you are and where you live.
You're up, David.
It's pretty packed in here tonight.
Well, good evening, Mayor Paulson, council members and staff, and special welcome to our new council member. My name is David Muller, and I live here in Larkspur, and I'm representing the 24 members of the Larkspur Climate Group. And we'd like to draw your attention to an email that was sent to each of you Monday from my email address, including to Dan Schwartz. And the email asks that in Larkspur's 2023 strategic planning process, that you make a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions a top priority and to consider climate impacts in all decisions, policy, and programs. Now, as you know, Larkspur made strong climate statements and commitments in adopting its 2021 Climate Emergency Resolution and its 2021 Climate Action Plan 2030. And these include a statement specifically around the subject tonight. And I read, quote, "A climate emergency threatens our city, region, state, nation, humanity, and the natural world, requiring urgent action." And further it states, quote, "The city council will elevate climate issues to be a high priority in its biannual goal setting process." So the commitment's already there. And now the community needs the council to fulfill these commitments by making climate action and particularly reduction of greenhouse gas emissions a top priority in Larkspur's planning process. Now, we certainly recognize there are other pressing priorities, but you know, when you step back and think about it, there really is no greater priority than making climate action and particularly greenhouse gas reduction and doing what reducing greenhouse gases and doing what we can to keep our community and our planet inhabitable. And as I've said many times before, and it's right there in the climate emergency resolution, to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And what we're asking you to do is to view all of the city's decisions, actions, and activities through a climate lens. So most of the greenhouse gas emission reductions that Larkspur has achieved over the past several years have resulted from the formation of MCE, or Clean Energy, and consequently Larkspur and its residents got the benefit of receiving electricity generated from increasingly renewable resource. But as noted in the cap, to make further significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, Larkspur is really going to have to take direct action, and with its municipal facilities, and really, most importantly, through encouraging its residents and through policy to get its residents to move away from fossil fuels. And I want to repeat that. The city's really going to have to take action. It's not going to be like MCE where somebody else took that action. Our greenhouse gas emissions simply are not going to decrease on their own. And worse, they have the potential to increase with the construction of additional housing if that housing is built with gas infrastructure, because there'll be even more greenhouse gas emissions. So we'd be headed in the wrong direction. As I've said before, the 2 biggest sources of greenhouse gas emissions for Larkspur are transportation, which accounts for about 60% of all emissions, and buildings at about 25% of all emissions. So just those two are 85% of all emissions. And from the buildings, it's mostly from use of natural gas for space and water heating. So transitioning to EVs for electric vehicles for transportation and to high efficiency electric heat pumps for space and water heating, all powered by electricity from renewable resource, really is the only viable solution that's available to us to significantly reduce our greenhouse gas emissions in the time frame we need to act. 85% are those two sources. So you probably know that our state and federal governments are promoting this transition by offering substantial financial incentives and rebates. But it will be many years before either our state or federal governments put specific requirements in place around those two. They're trying to incent right now, but no requirements. And we really can't wait that long. As stated in last year's report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we're in a code red situation for humanity that demands immediate action. And as local jurisdiction, we're much more nimble and able to act more quickly to get the ball rolling way ahead of state and federal governments. So what we need is for you to act now and to put policies in place to support this transition. And 3 of those policies have already been developed by the county in the form of the 3 model reach codes that we've talked about in the past, and that are sitting there ready for adoption by Larkspur. These 3 reach codes are viable, they've been widely vetted, they're cost effective, and they have already been adopted by many Marin jurisdictions. So I'd like to conclude with 3 specific asks on behalf of the Larkspur Climate Group. First, if you haven't already, please read our January 16th email message. It's pretty short, has some very concise information that we want to make sure everybody takes the opportunity to read. Secondly, in your 2023 planning process, which I understand may be coming up in the next month or 2, please make reduction of greenhouse gas emissions a top priority. And when you're looking at the other priorities, consider the climate impacts in those and in all decisions, policies, and programs. And third, we really are requesting that you please schedule a public discussion of the 3 model reach codes early this year and join other Marin jurisdictions in adopting those reach codes. So thank you very much for the time, and it's great to be back here in City Hall live.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, David.
Hey, David, I just want to say thank you. I know you're a regular, you're passionate, and you don't let things slip off the radar. You know, you keep reminding us, and I appreciate it. So I just wanted to say thank you for your effort and all that you put into this. You know.
And I learned a lot from
Great, thank you. So we don't have anyone else in the chamber tonight. So Allison, is there anyone online wishing to speak?
Yes, our next public comment will come from James Holmes.
James Holmes, Larkspur, please take your time on electrification because our electric bills are going up all the time. That is when the lights are on, as not as a result of storms or heat. But I'd like to invite attention to a strange circumstance involving the city's contracted garbage collector, Marin Sanitary Service. When I went to pay my bill last week, I realized that the return stub said to make out the check not to Marin Sanitary, but to an affiliate, Marin Resource Recovery. Now, the invoice letterhead said Marin Sanitary, the return stub letterhead said Marin Sanitary, and the return address says Marin Sanitary, but the check's supposed to go to some other entity. This was the case for both the bills that I pay. You might want to check your own if you haven't sent it in yet. The Marin Resource reference is only on the return stub, not the invoice that you keep. When I called Marin Sanitary for an explanation of this discrepancy, to my surprise, the billing people couldn't explain it at all. They even said they were unaware of it. They even asked me to scan a picture of the stub and send it to them. Incidentally, when I said I preferred to make the check out to the actual service provider, Marin Sanitary, rather than affiliate, they said it was okay. Now, I've long wondered about the impact of Marin Sanitary's multiple affiliates, because when I worked as a corporate regulatory attorney for the state insurance department, I saw firsthand how inter-affiliate machinations can work to inflate costs and rates. Marin Sanitary has always denied doing this. Now, however, it appears they want the customer's entire payment to go to a different entity than the actual service provider. This seems very strange and warrants explanation and correction, in my view. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Anybody else?
Comment.
Okay, thank you. So then let's move on to our next agenda item, which is presentations and proclamations. And tonight we have a presentation from Bartle Associates on our Larkspur actuarial PERS pension plans. So staff report, please.
No staff report, but I will introduce,
That was me.
oh. Sorry, I thought you were saying you couldn't hear me. I'm very pleased tonight to have Mary Beth Redding from, it's actually now Foster and Foster, not Bartell. I guess they have merged or changed names. To give us an overview of the actuarial or the GASB 68 that's required to calculate our pension liability that we have every year. So it's a little more in depth and a little bit complicated. So I thought Dan and I both thought it would be a great idea with our new council members to delve into pension. So Mary Beth, you are up.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Hopefully I'm sharing my screen. Yes, okay. And I think I can make this full screen, maybe. Maybe not. Okay, we'll just live with it. Okay. My name is Mary Beth Redding. I'm an actuary. I used to work for Bartell Associates, and now due to acquisition, I work for Foster and Foster. We are a consulting actuarial firm in California. And most importantly for tonight, we are not CalPERS at all. So we're here to talk to you about CalPERS and your pension benefits through CalPERS as sort of an outsiders to try to give you an explanation of what's going on with CalPERS. I'm going to spend a fair amount of time talking about CalPERS itself and how they do things, and then about the plans that Larkspur sponsors. So starting with CalPERS, they are an entity that is based in the California Government Code. They've been around since 1932, so longer than certainly me and probably most of us here. There is over 2 million members in the CalPERS system. Those are employees and retirees who will get pension benefits from CalPERS. And about 650,000 of those members are public agency members, meaning they were not state employees or school district employees, but they worked for local agencies like cities and towns. There are over 1,500 public agencies that are members of CalPERS, and CalPERS is still, it doesn't have as much money quite as it did, a year or so ago. It still has $450 billion of assets and is the largest US pension fund. So it's quite a very large agency that controls a lot of the pensions for our public employees in the state. So what CalPERS does is that the organization of CalPERS administers those pension plans in accordance with rules that are set out in the law and the board's adopted policies. So, for example, a list of all the pension benefits you're allowed to give your employees is in the state code. CalPERS does all the tracking of data needed to calculate benefits for retirees. They do those calculations, they counsel retirees, and they write checks. And then CalPERS also is responsible for collecting the money to run the system. Their actuaries determine what the contributions are in accordance again with the policies, and then they collect those contributions from employees and employers. And they also invest those funds to ensure that there will be enough money in the future to pay benefits as required. CalPERS is run by a board. There's 13 members, which is quite a big board. The one thing I find really interesting is that even though 6 of those members are elected by, the board members are elected by employees and retirees, there's really no board member elected by public agencies, by the cities and the towns to represent their interests. Okay, CalPERS is always happy to have you show up at a board meeting and tell them how you think they're doing. So the benefits that CalPERS provide are what we call defined benefit plans. And what that means is there's a benefit formula specified in the law that lists that says what is the pension benefit an employee will receive when they retire. It's usually stated as some sort of factor like 2.5%, and it gets multiplied by a person's years of service and by their pay near retirement. And so, for example, your miscellaneous tier 1 formula is 2.5% times service times final year's pay. That calculation would be done for anyone retiring at age 55 or older, and that would be the pension they would get for life. There is a cost of living limited to 2% a year increase on the benefits. And it's really important to remember that the city employees are not in Social Security, so this is their major retirement income source. City actually at this moment has 6 CalPERS pension plans. And that may be a little bit of a surprise to some of you, but I want to go through them really quickly, not everything on this slide, but just to say that 3 of them are for your miscellaneous employees that is not sworn fire or police are counted as miscellaneous. And that's really all of your current employees. There's different tiers based on when people were hired, and in general, the older hires have a better benefit than the newer employees, and those who have the higher benefit levels are also asked to make a higher contribution out of their pay every year. You still have also 3 fire tiers that covered the fire employees before they went off to become part of Central Marin Fire. The benefits they had earned while city employees are still sitting there at CalPERS, and the city's responsible for keeping those sort of remnant plans well funded. Again, there's 3 of them depending on when people were hired. And there is no employee contribution since they're not working for you anymore and not earning any further benefits. You'll see the word PEPRA in this chart. PEPRA was a law passed in 2012 to try to help pension plans offered for California employees become more sustainable. They have a lower benefit formula that's paid to retirees. But a couple of other key things that happened were that the employees who get the PEPRA benefits are required to fund half of that benefit themselves. And the pay that can be counted in determining a PEPRA person's benefit is limited. A fairly high number right now, if you're not in Social Security, $175,000 a year. But I think going into the future, that will help. That number doesn't go up as quickly as pays do, and so it'll help rein in pension costs a little bit in the future. I did mention that members make contributions for the classic members. That amount they pay, for instance, your miscellaneous tier 1 is paying 8% of pay. That's specified in the law, and it never changes. The PEPRA people pay half of what it costs. That can go up and down, but the city has to pay everything that members don't. So there's sort of what I think of as the pension rule. It's very basic. It's pretty obvious, but worth spending 30 seconds on it. CalPERS system is built to pay retirees benefits, and it also needs money to just fund itself, to pay for the cost of running the system. The only place it can get money from is contributions from employees and employers and investment earnings. There's no other magic source of funds. Okay. So if, for example, investment earnings happen to be poor one year, the system still needs to pay out benefits and expenses. They have to have money to do that. The only way money can come in is from employee and employer contributions being higher. So it's always a balance. The system has to balance in the long run. Okay. A couple more slides of background. I've been using this word normal cost. It's an actuarial term. It refers to the value of benefits that employees earn every year. The actuarial accrued liability we'll talk a little bit more about going forward. That's the value of all the benefits that have been earned in the past. So you can think of it as a past service liability or the accumulation of all the normal costs that have been paid for all the members in the past. And the target would be to have as much money set aside in CalPERS funds to cover the actuarial liability. For most plans right now, and actually very happily, not the city, but for almost all other plans, there is not enough money to cover the actuarial accrued liability. That means there's an unfunded liability, and that is required to be paid off over time. So every year the city has to pay to CalPERS the cost of benefits being earned that year. And then if there is an unfunded liability, you'll make a payment towards the unfunded liability. Why is there unfunded liabilities? A lot of it we think goes back to the investment return. This chart shows you about 25 years of investment return is the little green dots on that line. You can see it's, you know, your typical investment return chart, a lot of ups and downs. The blue line across the middle is CalPERS's target. So we measure everything relative to their target. If it's better than the target, it's a good year. If it's below the target, even if it's a positive return, it's not a good year. 2021 was a really good year for CalPERS. They earned about 21%. And in 2022, I think the official numbers come in at minus 7.5%. So quite a bit below their target. We'll talk more about the impact of that going forward. So investment returns, particularly in 2008 and 2009, led to a lot of the pension issues we're still seeing today. Some really quickly, some other things that contributed were that CalPERS had implemented a lot of smoothing to help people be able to budget their contributions. That was fine, but it didn't pay off the unfunded liabilities very well. We had a wave across California in the early 2000s of these enhanced benefits. There was a feeling that there was more money than was ever going to be needed in pension plans, so why don't we increase benefits? In hindsight, that was a really bad decision. And then lastly, what we continue to see across California is that we have all the time more and more retirees, to the point where we have many more retirees than active employees. That's okay. We've been planning for that. We like retirees. That's why there's a pension plan to pay the retirees, but it can create a lot more volatility, a lot more ups and downs in your contribution. And Larkspur has, you know, relative, the ratio of active retirees to active employees is a lot higher than for other agencies. So you would be expecting more volatility, more unexpected increases and decreases going forward than other cities might. CalPERS has been working on this. They're making a lot of changes to try to get funded percentages up. And the whole slew of changes they've made really ends up increasing cities' future costs and contribution rates. It's back to, we have these benefits to pay for, we have to get the money. Really, the only source of outside funding is either more investment return or more money from cities and employees. Should I ask for questions so far, or do you want me to go on?
Sure. Do any council members have any questions?
I do actually.
Yeah.
Can I would like to just go back to slide or page 3 about the board.
Yes.
You mentioned that they're elected by members. Are the board members paid, and what are necessarily their qualifications?
Ooh, I don't know what they're paid. I would assume that, like most board members, they're paid at least a nominal amount, and they have expenses and training reimbursed and things like that. But I'm just guessing. The elected members, I think, can be anyone that wins an election. I don't think there's a particular qualification required.
Okay. Seems like they're managing a lot of money, and you would need a lot of qualifications to be able to do that, but
I'm hoping that those who are appointed, you know, by the governor and by the state officials have some minimal qualifications in that area.
that's it. Thanks.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, just a clarifying. So each jurisdiction that participates, each city, has its own account with CalPERS, which keeps track of separately their employees, their liabilities. It's not, you know, mixed across. So when you say it's got, you know, X number of billions of dollars, that's total, but that's broken down by city on some level. So we would be able to, if we wanted to, or if it were available, we could say, okay, how much does Larkspur have in CalPERS and what is our, annual requirements to put in things like that?
Exactly.
Okay.
And I should say legally, it's not quite that simple, but for all intents and purposes, you should think of that as your money at CalPERS.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay,
Okay. I'm going to go on and actually talk more about that last question and start with the miscellaneous plan. So this is a plan that covers Larkspur's current active employees. There's 32 of them. I should have mentioned that everything at CalPERS lags. So all the current information I'm presenting from CalPERS's report is as of June 30th, 2021. So a year and a half ago when the world was a different place than it is right now. So at that point, the city had 32 active employees. You had a bunch of people they categorized as transferred or separated who used to work for the city and are working somewhere else now, and 69 retirees. So quite a lot more retirees than active employees. And if we look at how they're split up by tier, the important thing I want you to see is how many of your members are PEPRA members. 18 of those 32 employees are PEPRA members. A little bit over half by head count, a little bit under half by pay, because they tend to be a little lower paid because they're your newer employees. The reason that's important is that the PEPRA benefit has a lot more cost controls in it. It's a lower benefit, employees are funding more. And as we get more and more employees being PEPRA members, it helps control the costs. This is a busy chart. There's a lot of information in here, but it's showing exactly what are the city's liabilities. What do you owe for benefits for your miscellaneous employees, and how much do you have allocated to you in assets? So I have 3 sets of columns here, and I'm going to look at the middle one, which is the results at June 30th of 2021. The far right is what we have projected for 2022. So in 2021, it's hard to see under the labels. The multicolored column is the liabilities, the actuarial liabilities for your employees and retirees. And the dark blue part is how much is for retirees, about $22 million. The little reddish patch on the top is how much belongs to your active employees, a much smaller piece, totaling just about $30 million. The green column next to it, and I'll say again, this is very unusual for a CalPERS plan, and the city's really to be commended for this. The green column of the assets is actually more than the plan's liabilities, about $32 million. So altogether, you're about $2.5 million overfunded. We would call it 108% funded. Why is that true? Because the city put in fiscal year 20 an additional not required $8 million into the plan that got you into this very good position. You can imagine that if you had not put $8 million into the plan, it would not be overfunded at the moment. So most of that great funded status is due to the very good asset return CalPERS had in fiscal 21. If we project forward to 2022, they had a terrible return that pretty much wiped out all the gains from 2021. And we expect the funded status will be back very close to where it was 2 years ago, about $1 million underfunded. Still at 97% funded, very, very good for a CalPERS plans. You're much better funded than the run-of-the-mill plans. This is a complicated slide. What it's meant to say is the numbers I just showed you are the ones CalPERS publishes to determine what your contributions are. We think those are the best numbers to be looking at when you're trying to ask how well funded is my plan. The accounting rules under GASB 68 are very different. They measure things at different dates. They use a different discount rate to discount the liabilities. Even for and then because you're in what CalPERS calls the risk pool, they do a very different allocation of liabilities and assets among everybody in the risk pool. So even things that you would think would be the same, the plan assets at June 30th of 21 end up being close to $34 million for your accounting, for your financial statement reporting, and under $33 million is CalPERS counts them for contributions. It's really due to difference in allocation methods. The GASB rules are really designed for plans that don't look very much like CalPERS to make reporting consistent across very large state plans across the country. And so, you know, we could spend a lot of time going through the differences, but the major message of this slide is that the numbers are just different. If you want the most meaningful number, I think it's the right-hand numbers, the cash contribution ones, because that's really going to drive your future cash flows. And the last thing about miscellaneous, I just wanted to show you what the contributions are required going forward. Typically, they're expressed as a percentage of payroll. The biggest part of the contribution you owe is the normal cost, the cost of benefits being earned in a year. And for coming out of the 21 valuation, so what you'll pay next year, fiscal 23-24, is about 10.5% of pay, and there'll be no unfunded liability payment going forward in that year. We expect it'll pop up again in the following year. So about 10% of pay is a good number to think of as what will this plan cost us in the long run? And then is that a sustainable amount for us? And I think you're in a very good position due to the large cash infusion that was made a couple years ago. Okay, if we look at the safety plan, things are kind of different. This plan has no more active employees.
Mary Beth, I think
Sorry.
our finance director had something to say.
Yeah, I
Sure.
just wanted to interject and go back to why we are super funded for that period of time. And it is the council's decision to go out and issue pension bonds, pension obligation bonds that allowed us to pay off that unfunded liability with PERS at a cheaper rate with the pension bonds. I just wanted to point that out, that that's why that has happened. So that's awesome decision making.
And we refinanced too, didn't we?
The pension bonds,
Yeah.
no.
No, I thought we refinanced in 2020.
We refinanced our one of our other debts, not
Oh.
the pension debt.
Okay, thank you.
Actually, sorry, can you refresh my memory? I thought that the pension obligation bond was purchased in 2020. And how's that relate to, so we had unfunded liability, and I believe the interest rate was 6.5%, and we got something closer to 2.5 to 3.5. And that difference is to this day, you know, in our cash flow, you know, favor.
Correct. So basically over the life of the debt service and what we would have paid PERS if we would have continued on their debt service plan in a sense, and what we're paying through our pension obligation bonds, we'll save about 8.8 million.
Correct. And what I was trying to, you know, so in the slides, I didn't see any mention of the POB, but I believe it's exactly in what we're talking about. So this 108% funding in 2021, how does that relate? Is it because our normal payments, is that the correct term? You know, were in our favor and therefore allowed us to be, you know, our position then was overfunded by that amount. But then what offset it was the classic and tier one with the market going down, that offset whatever the POB might have been benefiting us.
When PERS does not make their investment return projections, it'll result in a liability. Our liability with PERS will be smaller. So when they did really well, we got super funded in a sense for that small period of time. And it'll, as Mary Beth, I think it's important as we go through this is to realize that will keep changing continually.
So they're
Can
two
we-
I'm sorry.
I just want to clarify, because I think Mr. Mayor, you didn't mean to state something you said. Nothing's eroded the gains we made by doing the pension obligation bonds. That involves fixed costs. That was the cost of the volatile unfunded liability with PERS and turning it into a fixed debt. So nothing ever erodes the savings you generated by doing that. So I think what you meant to say is because we put that money in against our unfunded liability, any gains in an annual year may have been affected by the volatility of their investments, which is, I just want to make sure we're careful what we say so the public doesn't lose confidence in what was a very prudent fiscal decision.
Yeah, I was about to qualify. What I understand is there are two factors at play. What we control, which was our restructuring of debt and bringing down the cost. And as you said, Mr. City Manager, that part stays in play, but we're also involuntarily at the mercy of what the market is doing. And so when those gains went down in 2022, even our strengthened position, brought us from overfunded to underfunded. So that would be the more complete picture of why we went down. Is that correct?
I think you're on the right track. I think if Mary Beth finishes her presentation, she's probably going to talk to you about how the volatility of their investment fund leads to us maybe having to make payments any given year, which I think is where we're headed on that.
Okay, thank you.
You're exactly right, Dan. Thank you for that. I think there's a perception often that if you can pay off your unfunded liability at CalPERS, it's like paying off your mortgage and you're done. But it's not. All you've done is you've taken, if you look in my 2021 bars, you've taken and put enough assets in that you now have as much assets as the liabilities. But exactly like happened in 2022, if investment returns are poor, you now have less assets in the following year and it's not enough and you're unfunded again. And then CalPERS has a good year and you're overfunded. So there's always going to be a lot of volatility generated by this. It'll look like huge swings in the unfunded liability. You're going from 1.1 million to minus 2.4 to plus 1. It looks like huge changes in the number, but it's really just not too big a changes in the asset value that are swinging that back and forth. Okay. So I'm going to switch over and talk about safety. We talked a little, I think I started to say it's very different. We don't have active employees. These transferred members are the firefighters that you used to have that are now working for Central Marin Fire. And then we also have fire retirees. Similar to what we saw for the miscellaneous group, if we look at the liabilities, they're shown here in blue. We don't have any active employees. In 2020, the plan was less than 100% funded. Again, being in such great shape because of the pension obligation bond and the $10 million additional that was put into the fund in fiscal 20. It was in a good position to start out. And then when you had the good investment return in 2021, it became 108% funded, about $3 million overfunded. And then again, next year, we expected to slip down underfunded pretty much where it was 2 years ago. And that volatility, that up and down, is going to continue every year in the future. You're just never going to be done with this plan as long as any of these people are around, and that will be a very long time.
Okay, can I ask you a question about this?
Yes.
Since we have no active members, and we're not planning on having active members because this is all Central Marin at this point, that number should never go up at this point. Is that right? It's just going to, continually go down over time. Is that correct?
It will go up because
When people retire, is that?
yeah, we're doing present value calculations. So right now, for all the people, these 19 people who are not yet retired, their liability is discounted because we know, those guys are like 40. Let's say we have 15 years to save up money for them to retire. So their liability is going to grow and grow and grow until they retire. Once everybody's retired, it'll start dropping.
Okay. And I'm assuming that somebody works 5 years, for Larkspur, and then as they're now working for Central Marin, when they retire, the percentage of the payments would be higher depending on it's divided based on the amount of years they work for one agency versus the other. Is that accurate?
Exactly. You'll pay your benefit formula, your percentage, times the number of years they work for Larkspur, but multiplied by the final pay they get at Central Marin. So it's almost like allocated on the amount of service at each agency.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
We talked about everything we need to talk to there. Again, particularly compared to other public agencies' safety plans, your plans are so much better funded. You're in a very good position. Because in general, safety plans are not as well funded as miscellaneous plans. So Larkspur looks very good in comparison to all of the other CalPERS safety plans. Again, a slide just sort of demonstrating the difference in the numbers for accounting for financial reporting under GASB 68 and for funding the required contributions. You would think that these would be kind of the same, but they're not, mostly due to the GASB 68's allocation methods. You're reporting a $5.8 million overfunded at June 30th of 2022 versus $3 million overfunded. That's as comparable as we can in June 30th of 21. And so just pointing out that just like for funding purposes, the plan will be less well funded. Next year, we're expecting a big drop in the funded status as the accounting rules change next year. When we look at contributions for safety, there is no normal cost. Employees are not earning any future benefits. It's all been taken into account already. The plan was a little bit unfunded last year, so there was an unfunded payment in 22-23 of about $62,000. And even though the plan as a whole is overfunded in 2021, one of the pieces, the PEPRA piece, is very slightly underfunded. So there's a little tiny ongoing unfunded liability payment. And if you looked just at the safety contribution, required contribution going forward, you'll likely see it going up and down a lot. There's no normal cost to make it look more stable. We would hope that the numbers will never be very big, but they'll change a lot from year to year. Okay. We have the two plans together. The total actuarial liability is $70 million. You have $76 million as of June 30th, 21 at CalPERS. So really quite big numbers, but very slightly more assets than liabilities. So altogether between the two plans, you were about $5 million overfunded, 108%. And again, for 2022, we're expecting that will be just under 100% funded. But still, overall, I have to say, a very, very good position. That was my last slide. Are there any questions?
Kevin, do you guys have any questions?
No questions, but just thank you very much for that. This is Kevin. Thank you very much for that presentation.
Thank you.
The bottom line for me is challenges ahead, but good news for now.
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry, Kevin Carroll, did you have any questions or?
No, I reviewed it and it's excellent.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, this is great. So we don't have any further questions. I don't know if we bring this out for any public questions, or I think that's the end of the presentation proclamation. Yeah. I don't know. Allison, would we take public comment or city manager?
Well, I can look for any hands raised from our audience members. We do have a hand raised from Larry Chu.
Okay, great. Welcome, Larry.
Unmute him now. There we go.
I welcome Mayor Paulson and Larkspur City Council. As you know, I did quite a bit of work on this a couple times for the MCCMC. I think several of the questions that you had asked as a group can be found in the white papers that we had written back in June of 2011, and again in September 2019 as a follow-up. City Manager Swartz was on those committees with me, so if he doesn't have a copy of those and you can't get them off the NCCMC website, I'd be happy to forward those to you. I think some of the things in terms of history, when you go back to Senate Bill 400 back in 1999, it's not quite as simple as just saying that, you know, there was a surplus in the funds. What really killed, you know, the ability for CalPERS to stay current is the fact that not only did they provide increases in benefits, they made them retroactive. So that, you know, that's an important distinction there, because the actuarial assumptions that were made prior to that, you know, were never, you know, they didn't have the ability to carry that forward other than to dip into the surplus. And they immediately lost that, you know, with a recession that followed in the early 2000s. I think Councilmember Wade, you had asked about the composition of the board, for example. 6 members of that 13-member board are elected by the retirees and employees. And you have 4 ex officio members that are California elected officials, 2 of them which have financial backgrounds. It's usually the controller and I'm blanking on title treasurer or something like that. And then you have 3 people that are appointed by the governor. Now, one of the difficulties we find, and it's included in the report, is when it comes to impartiality, at no more than 2 members are going to be considered independent. You know, and in this particular situation, for example, the other at least 9 will be either current retirees who receive the benefits or potential retirees because they're state employees or some other form of an appointed member who is a potential recipient of CalPERS. So, you know, I encourage you to go back to those white papers that I had written and issue further explanation on, you know, a lot of the things that Mary Beth had provided to you, you know, as a summary presentation. Happy to take any questions.
Yeah, but I did want to thank you, Larry. I remember in 2019, when you were still mayor, the integral role you played with the pension obligation bonds and the research. And I think we're in a good position largely, you know, this big part of it was you. So thank you for that.
Thank you. And I'm so glad to see that some of the actions we took in 2019 have resulted in a pension surplus.
Thank you.
And give that credit to the city manager and our finance director putting all that together.
Great.
Yeah. Thank you again, Larry. Any other public comment?
Stands from our audience members. There's no further public comment.
Okay. So with that, one more time, bring it back to the council. Anything else? Kathy, thank you so much for this. And Mary Beth, thanks for a really nice, clear explanation, well laid out, you know, answering all our questions here. And I think we all feel pretty good about things at the moment. So thank you.
Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you.
I really wanted to acknowledge and thank Kathy. She suggested that we hadn't done a pension overview in quite a while.
Yeah.
I think it's really helpful to just do this once in a while to remind ourselves how the system works. And then I think Mary Beth really captured what was a key thing I wanted you to take away from the presentation tonight, which is her mention that it's not like the mortgage on your house. When we made that big payment, we didn't stop having obligations, because I think as people see our budgets, they might wonder why we're still having to budget periodically to make contributions that are sizable to CalPERS beyond our payroll. And it's because we're going to periodically have to do corrections for the poorer performance years of their portfolio. The good news is, because we're in such a strong position, Kathy and I have the ability now to monitor what CalPERS is doing, and we can get a sense of, oh, this is going to be a bad year. We need to be prepared to shore up our budget for the next year to deal with an anticipated, for lack of a better term, true-up payment that's going to come down the pipe.
Yeah, I think we all appreciate Kathy, not just for this, but for the whole finance department. So thank you very much. Yeah. And we have more to come, I think, more Kathy coming. So, okay, so with that, let's conclude our agenda item 3 and move on to agenda item 4, which is the approval of the consent calendar. So we have 5 items listed tonight, and I wanted to see if any council member or member of the public would like to pull one of those items for discussion.
I'm going to ask 4.5. If we could just pull that, I'd love to get a quick report on that.
Okay. Any other? Okay, so with that, why don't we see if we can get a motion to pass 4.1 to 4.4, and then we can return to discussion of 4.5.
I'll make that motion.
Second.
Great. So we have a motion and a second to approve 4.1 to 4.4 of the consent calendar. A roll call, please.
Councilmember Carroll,
Yes.
Councilmember Hara,
Yes.
Councilmember Way,
Yes.
Vice Mayor Kendall,
Yes.
Mayor Paulson.
Yes. Okay, so for 4.5, could we please have a staff report?
Mr. Mayor, council members, the item in front of you is one that was sent after approval by the Central Marin Fire Council that governs the Central Marin Fire Department or Fire Authority. The matter pertains to deficits that have occurred in the budget of Central Marin Fire, and I'll go over those briefly in a minute. Central Marin Fire's internal operations are governed by a management committee that consists of myself and the town manager for Corte Madera, which is Adam Wolf. And we consult closely with the finance director for the Central Marin Fire, which is also the town's finance director, Daria Correa. Then with the chief, Ruben Martin. Periodically, with both our public safety agencies, we run into challenges because of unanticipated costs. And unfortunately, from time to time, those unanticipated costs exceed what we've allocated both in the general fund for our public safety JPAs and in any additional funds that we're using to cover those costs. When that occurs, we have to make a decision about how we're going to cover those. At the end of the day, the general funds of the member agencies are the ultimate guarantors of any deficits of the public safety JPAs. So at the end of the day, the member agencies absorb that particular operational obligation. Sometimes we don't have, or we aren't in a position as a member agency to contemplate a one-time correction of a deficit. When we're in those circumstances, we try to come up with a way to deal with the deficit over several years. That can present some significant challenges due to other unanticipated events that may occur. And so in years when the member agencies of the JPA find themselves in a stronger fiscal position, we consider whether or not to make one lump sum correction payment. And that's what's recommended here this evening. Now, specifically, the deficits that occurred are both the results of some unanticipated problems and challenges that occurred with the operations of Central Marin Fire. One of those was approved by the management committee. The others were completely unanticipated. We had a considerably higher overtime incurrence than we normally do. Usually with a fire agency, most of the overtime overages are due to sending our firefighters out to help with fires that are going to be compensated in terms of staff time by the state. But in this case, we incurred a significant overtime expense because we were losing so many of our firefighters to COVID and other reasons that they were ill. We also had an unanticipated disability retirement that left our ranks lower than we had anticipated and forced us to use overtime to deal with that. And because of that, the general fund of the fire authority found itself in an unanticipated deficit position when they reconciled the books for the year. Additionally, we had more injuries than anticipated, and so the insurance fund also found itself in a deficit position that was unanticipated. We typically try to fund all of our agencies so that they can incur approximately 4 significant claims against the agency in any given year. And unfortunately, in this particular year, the authority had some claims that exceeded that amount. So in light of those things and finding that the audit for the authority was indicating a deficit, the management committee met and concluded that it would be best to cure those deficits immediately, given both the city and the town have money in their reserves currently to cover those deficits. And that way should we find ourselves in a less strong position down the road, we're not still dealing with this problem. We've cured it now when we have the funds. So that's the item in front of you. And it does come to you with the Fire Council having approved this and approved this request to each of the member agencies. With that, I'm available for any questions.
Could I ask a question?
Yeah.
All right, so my concern, it's not whether we're going to pay this or not, because we already spent it. You know, it's like a credit card, we got to pay it. My question is more moving forward. Are these the types of things that should be addressed to prevent this from reoccurring, whether it's the overtime or the claims? I mean, are we either underestimating this moving forward, or is there some training to avoid future claims? Is there something that is this a red flag that we should take to change some type of behavior moving forward? Or are we just writing this off as an abnormal year, and without changing anything, we don't expect it to repeat itself?
There's one change we've made as a result. Otherwise, I would say the vast majority of this should be acknowledged as I would say once per decade, whether it's the fire authority or the police authority, you're going to have these years where injuries are just well beyond what the actuary projected. And maybe I should note, through our risk pool based cities, we have an actuary project what our insurance fund should be. So we don't do that without a third party validation. So we usually are quite accurate, and most years we have plenty of money in the insurance fund to deal with claims. So I really feel that was a blip. Where I think the management committee has changed its internal practice, we've often been perhaps a little bit fiscally tolerant of the desire of both chiefs and both JPAs to hire people, particularly currently, because the hiring market is really challenging. I can tell you, for the first time in my career, we're having to figure out how to get people to apply to be firefighters. It's always been a long line of folks who want to be a firefighter, but that's just not necessarily the case anymore. From time to time, the chief comes and he says, I know so-and-so is retiring. Can I overlap? Can I hire this person before I lose them to another agency? I think had the management committee understood the depth of the problem we were having with overtime, we probably would not have approved that just to manage this particular number. So we've added now to our list of questions prior to authorizing that sort of expenditure. Where is our current position in terms of personnel costs, particularly overtime? So that'd be the one change we've made that in this case would have knocked off about 20% of the deficit that we incurred in the general fund of the fire authority.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Great. Any other Discussion or considerations on item 4.5? Okay, so Scott, I really appreciate the questions and Dan, I really appreciate the answers. Do we have a motion to pass 4.5 on the consent agenda?
I'd like to move the passage of it, Kevin. Thanks.
Okay,
Second,
great. So we have a motion and a second. Allison, roll call, please.
Councilmember Carroll,
Yes,
Councilmember Hara,
Yes.
Councilmember Way,
yes.
Vice Mayor Kendall,
Yes.
Mayor Paulson.
Yes. So that item passes. So the entire consent calendar passes unanimously. And let's move on then to item 5, which is the city manager's oral report.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, council members. I have a few things I wanted to share with you and the public. First, I want to just give a big thank you to all our first responders, performed beyond anyone's expectations in the storms, which I think can be indicated by the fact that we had very little public damage. I know a lot of private property had their own challenges, but we had some downed trees on our public lands. We were able to deal with that. Probably the only really significant challenge we had involving public infrastructure was the power outage that occurred on one of the evenings that lasted most of the night. That did affect some of our storm drain pumps, and we're now having to revisit our protocols around how we manage a storm situation where a power outage is a possibility, so that we're able to deal with that. We did have the resources to make sure that any waters that rose as a result of that power outage we could deal with, but I know there are some concerned neighborhoods that experienced some stressful moments as we dealt with that situation. And now that we understand how the grid's probably going to behave, should there be an extended power outage, we'll be better prepared in the future. And we've made changes to our internal protocols to deal with that. I also wanted to note 2 recent newspaper articles that mentioned Larkspur, and I want to encourage folks. There's some resources online they can go to get more information. Some folks may have seen an article in the Marin IJ that discussed the possibility that the Ross Valley Fire Department and the Central Marin Fire Authority might be looking at shared services or even more significant consolidation of operations. I want to stress that that discussion is in its infancy, and the newspaper article is the product of a report that the Ross Valley Fire Department commissioned by a consultant to look at various options. And there have not been significant discussions between the agencies that would constitute anything remotely.
So why don't we see if
He's frozen.
yeah, give him a few seconds. If we don't get Dan in like, half a minute, then we can move on to the council members or reports and return to his report when he gets back, so we can keep moving. But Dan and Councilmember Carroll are both in Sacramento now, and I'll be joining him tomorrow. And I guess it's 90 miles, slows down the internet sometimes. Okay, so it looks like he's frozen. Why don't we see if there are any council member oral reports? Okay, well, usually do. Okay, Scott?
I've got none.
Oh, no. Kevin, any reports, council member oral reports or comments?
See, the other
waiting.
Kevin's got his hand up.
Okay,
yeah, I've got just a couple. One, I attended the Marin City Martin Luther King Day celebration, which was fascinating. I could have skipped the white politicians' speeches, quite frankly, but what made it really worthwhile was the the performing stars of Marin, which were kids, must have been about at least 15 to 20 between the ages of 6 to 10, who did a version of Wade in the Water that was just spectacular. And then a performance by the Lighthouse Singers. And so it was very uplifting experience to go through that. The other thing, just of note, particularly for the council members who liaison, excuse me, with the chamber, is there's a long history I'll skip, but bottom line, the Muirwood shuttle is going to be operating out of the Larkspur ferry parking lot for about the next 5 months, except on holidays. They switch it back to Sausalito, which makes no sense, quite frankly, to switch it back and forth, because all it does is confuse an awful lot of people. But it brings in the last 6 months of last year that they ran it, about 10,000 visitors. So it's not insignificant. And with the Larkspur Mart being so close and sales taxes being a nice thing to have, that might be something the chamber might want to look into promoting. I do know that Sausalito has already contacted some members of Marin Transit to try to lobby to move it back to the south. So it's just something to be aware of. And then yesterday in driving around, as I do, there was a report on KCBS about all the horrible potholes in various cities. And the one consumer that they interviewed was a Larkspur resident raving about the roads of Larkspur, which I unfortunately didn't get her name. I don't think it was Mrs. Skinner or any of the male council members' wives. But it was nice to hear some positive thing on the radio. That's it.
Great, thank you, Kevin. So it looks, City Manager Schwartz, like you're back. If you want to pick up where you left off, I think you were talking about the Marin IJ article.
I did. I apologize. I was using the hotel Wi-Fi, and I'm going to not trust it anymore and use my cell phone now. Which I should probably say for declarative purposes that Councilmember Carroll and I are at the new mayors and council members meeting in Sacramento, and that's why we're Zooming this evening. So I was starting, I don't know where I got cut off, but I just wanted to assure the public, if you've read the Ross Valley Fire Department article, it stemmed from a presentation made to that board by a consultant that they'd commissioned about potential governance options for their authority going forward. We have told representatives of the authority, and we've told the consultants that Central Marin is always interested in shared services if it's in the best interest of the public. And so in this report, which is available online at the Ross Valley Fire Department's website, you can see that we're discussed as an option. And I think there was significant conversation at their board meeting that produced the newspaper article you saw. What I want to assure the public is no one's made any commitments. No substantive discussions have advanced beyond we're always open to talk. Chief Martin is discussing a little bit with their current chief, which is the county chief, Chief Jason Weber, sort of some rough parameters of ways they might share services, but there will be a lot of public process and a lot of public discussion before any decision is ever made. I had a few folks read that article and I think interpret it to mean there's been significant negotiations going on and no public discussion about that. And I just want to reassure folks that's not the case. But we are, and this council in particular has always directed me to explore partnerships, to find ways to serve our public better. And so that's why we responded in that way when the inquiry came in. The other article I wanted to draw folks' attention to, there was an article about several Marin jurisdictions that are going to miss a deadline with respect to submitting our housing element to the state for review. That article didn't really get into the fact that the number of jurisdictions that are going to miss the deadline is probably tenfold, if not more, of the number that are going to miss it in Marin. We're not missing it because we're trying to play any games. We're not missing the deadline because we aren't figuring out how to adopt our housing element. Like the other Marin jurisdictions, we have taken very seriously the direction from the state to do public engagement differently with respect to our housing element this time, to do public vetting of our housing element differently this time. And so we've been going through a very thorough process. As two of our council members know, Mayor Paulson and Councilmember Haroff, who sit on a committee, we've had a lot of public meetings. The material's online. I encourage folks to go read it. We're getting very close to a point where we would submit a draft to the state so we can start to get feedback. But we are committed to meeting our legal obligations and we are moving forward. And I just want to assure folks of that. And I really encourage everyone to get the agenda for our housing element committee meetings and attend. I think you'll find them very informative. The other thing that I wanted to comment briefly for the council and the public is at the last meeting of the council, which was on rent stabilization, rental assistance, and eviction protections. The council asked that staff begin to work on a separate but parallel process for the council to review what it would mean to make any changes to the Tenant Protection Act locally with respect to eviction protections. And so we're going to kick that off with a meeting where we can hear from the public and in particular hear from landlords who might be affected by that. And so we now have a date for that special meeting and we'll be locking down the time and publicly noticing it, but it'll be on the evening of February 8th. And that's a Wednesday. And for the benefit of the council and the public, we heard loud and clear from several landlords at the special meeting you held recently that please make sure they're aware of that meeting. So we have built a mailing list of all of our landlords so that we can get the word out to them. And we will also use our normal processes to get the word out to the general public. So more to follow on that. But I wanted to just highlight that particular meeting is now at least on the calendar with the time to be locked down and firmed up. But I'm thinking it'll be generally 6 or 6:30 when we start. With that, Mr. Mayor, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Thank you, Dan. Any questions for the city manager?
I just, with the recent press inquiries, I think it would be helpful to reiterate what our protocol is, that the mayor speaks for the council and the city manager does first, if I'm correct about that, when there are press inquiries about issues. And I just think that that's probably a protocol we should make sure to follow so that you refer inquiries to the mayor first and the city manager.
Yeah, that has been the practice. And yeah, I think it's largely, one thing we want to do is to keep the debate organized and make sure everyone comes to the council sessions and not let, as I think the city manager's report, sometimes the media gets ahead of this of the realities of what's going on, like the partnerships. And so I think that's good advice. Any other questions or comments for the city manager? So Dan, I want to thank you for that. And I just wanted to say that the Housing Steering Committee that you're mentioning, that process we're still working on, I think that is on the 26th of this month at 6 o'clock. So if anyone in the public, I really highly encourage people to participate. This is an important discussion that we're having. Okay, so if there are no other questions, we can return back to, we sort of jumped ahead while the city manager reconnected his internet there. And I believe Councilmember Carroll had just told us, 3 reports. And Councilmember Haroff, did you have anything to report this
I
evening?
don't have anything this evening.
Okay, great. I just had a couple things. One is today was the SMART board meeting at 1:30. I attended, and one item that I thought it might be of interest to Larkspur is, one of the things I've really been following from the beginning with SMART is is the last mile solution, and my ears naturally perked up when we had a vendor come in here, Bolt, and they offered to install e-bikes so that you could get from City Hall to Smart, and it would be by the swipe of a credit card. And anyway, I really feel driving, getting people conveniently and quickly to the Smart station could be very helpful. And they, of course, that company folded. We don't have that. But what was announced today is that they're working at the Sonoma station on a last mile solution where they have a system that'll be a little bit like a shuttle service that works like Uber or Lyft. So essentially what this would be is they have two contracts. One is with the software service where between the Sonoma airport and the Smart station is about 1.2 miles. And that's just too far to walk. I mean, if you think about the Larkspur ferry and the Larkspur Smart station, that's a bit of an issue for some people. So this would be a shuttle that would go back and forth, but then because it's a demand service like Lyft or Uber, it could pick people up along the way. And there's a lot of planning. I'm really working through the documents, trying to understand it. But my interest in what I'm reporting here is that I'll be looking very closely at how this might be something we could use for the Larkspur station. And see if that would be something to help the Green Bay community or to help the downtown community or anywhere else if people want access either to the ferry or to Smart or both, and to have that as an option. So hopefully more to come. It's supposed to be rolled out in about 2-3 months, and we'll see how that benefits the Sonoma station and if that does anything down here. The second announcement is I really wanted to serving in this role this year, try to be available to the public and be more of a listener, make that time. So I'll try to hold office hours on Tuesday. And so this upcoming Tuesday, the 24th, 2:30 here in this room, I'll be here. I'll have an hour, and I'll try to send it out to the people who are in touch with me. But in general, anyone who's online listening, or anyone who wants to spread the word, I'm really just a listener to like all of us. All council members may be doing this in other ways, but I really would like to make sure that the community feels heard, and people can come and do this at their convenience during that hour. So with that, I think that's all council member reports, and our next item is public hearings, of which we have none. So then we can move to item number 8, which is the business items. 8.1 is the fiscal year 2021 audit of the city basic financial statements and the return of Kathy.
We're keeping on the financial end through this meeting. We have tonight our managing partner of Bedawati and Associates to give a presentation on our fiscal year ending 2022.
Good evening. I'm not sure if you're waiting on me, or I couldn't hear the last part.
You're up.
Okay, sorry. I was
No,
while I'm connecting as a panelist, I just lost audio, so I didn't know what was said in the last minute. So my apology.
No, you're fine. We're right on track.
All right. Well, thank you for inviting me to the meeting. I'm going to be sharing my screen, and I will start my presentation right away. Right, so hopefully you can see my my screen now. Yep. And this is our presentation for the fiscal year 2022 audit. What I'm going to cover today, I will let you know who the engagement team was, the deliverables and the scope of our audit, areas we emphasized on during our audit process, the type of audit report we issued, and summarize for you some of the numbers in the financial statements, provide you some of the required communications as the independent auditors, and as a brief summary of the new accounting standards coming your way. Finally, of course, if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt me anytime. You don't have to wait until the end of my presentation. As for our engagement team, this was the composition of our engagement team. I was the engagement partner. I had a manager and 2 professional staff working with me on that audit. We always have a quality control reviewer. This person is usually in the background. They provide a second set of eyes for reviewing the financial statements. They look at our work papers and make sure that we adhere to professional standards. In terms of our deliverables and the scope of our audit, we were mainly engaged to provide an opinion on the City of Larkspur basic financial statements. We are also required per government auditing standards to provide an opinion on internal control over financial reporting and on compliance. The city is a recipient of federal funds that subject the city to a compliance audit, what we refer to as a single audit. So we provide an opinion on the city's compliance with those federal grants and federal requirements. We perform agreed upon procedures on the appropriation limit. And then finally, we are responsible for communicating with the governing body, which is what I'm doing today. As far as our primary audit emphasis or areas of audit risk, we have 3 main areas that are pretty standard in most of our audits. I can't say that they are specifically unique to Larkspur. The first area relating to management override of control, the risk of management overriding control. Just to clarify, we're not aware that management is overriding control. However, this risk exists by nature. Management is the one responsible for designing and implementing and monitoring control, and they're probably in a position to override them if they choose to do so. So we design audit procedures to incorporate an element of unpredictability, so management cannot anticipate every single procedures we're going to be doing. We test journal entries made by management. We review estimates made by management to make sure they're free of bias. We evaluate business rationale for any unusual transactions. Another area of focus for us is revenue and receivable and the risk of improper revenue recognition. Again, auditing standards require us that we assume that this area is a higher risk area. So we rely heavily on confirmations from third parties. We send confirmations to the county, to the state, to other franchisees and taxing authorities, asking them to confirm amounts submitted to the city. We reconcile those to the city's accounting records and make sure that they are reconciled. And then finally, the pension and OPEB. I heard the presentation earlier by Mary Beth Redding. I'm definitely not going to get into that level of detail regarding pension and OPEB, but as you can probably tell, it is an area that is complex, that does require obtaining actuarial study, interpreting those actuarial study, and translating that into accounting entries. So we perform a lot of procedures to test the entries prepared by management, test the data submitted to CalPERS and to the actuaries, and also communicate directly with the auditors of the pension plan of CalPERS to ask them to verify the assets invested on the city's behalf. As far as our auditor's report, we have issued an unmodified opinion. The audit opinion states the standards that we followed, which are the generally accepted auditing standards and the government auditing standards. An unmodified opinion means that we believe the financial statements are fairly presented in all material respects, that all accounting policies have been consistently applied, that all estimates are reasonable, and that all disclosures are properly reflected in the financial statements. I wanted to just give you a 30,000-foot view of the numbers in your financial statements over the last 3 years. So this slide is a summary of the city's assets. Again, like most of our cities, 2 largest assets are usually cash and investments and capital assets. That's pretty typical. One new item this year is a net pension asset. I think Mary Beth have mentioned that CalPERS had a really good year. The numbers are based on the 2021 information or results, and CalPERS had some good earnings, 21% or so of earnings. So that, in addition to the city have already pre-funded using the pension obligation in the past, so that led to obviously the creation of that net pension asset. That is new for this year. Other than that, no other major fluctuation. The city continued to have projects that is adding on to capital assets, so that is expected.
Hey, can I ask a quick question? What are the receivables? Are those taxes that have not been collected?
Yeah, it will be a variety, mostly taxes. Yeah, so it can be also things like PBA funds or gas tax or other types of state funding. And taxes normally represent most of them.
Thank you.
Also, any grants that are yet to be received.
Sorry, thank you.
On this slide here is a summary of the city's liabilities over the last 3 years. Again, the net pension liability disappeared. It became a pension asset in this current year. OPEB liability also went down. Plus, overall, the market performance was a big factor in those liabilities going down. The unearned revenue, that's new for this year, and this is relating mostly to ARPA, basically the funds that were received and not yet spent. But again, other than that, I think everything else is fairly consistent. On this coming slide here is the net position, or the city's assets minus liabilities. This is basically the city's net worth, and we divide it into multiple categories. The net investment in capital asset, this is the amount invested in city streets and roads and buildings, and it is not in a spendable form. The restricted amounts are the amounts that have legal restrictions on them. So those can be unspent grant proceeds, bond proceeds, all those types of revenues that are restricted for a specified purpose. And then the unrestricted amount, this is the amount under the council control. This amount has been a deficit over the last few years, mostly due to pension and OPEB liabilities. Obviously, you can see for fiscal year 2022, this amount is a positive for the first time in a few years. And that's clearly the result of going from a net pension liability to a net pension asset during the year. I think you will see that more clearly, that these are the results of operations. So just total revenues minus total expenses. This is really looking at all city funds, including depreciation expense. So it's really a full accrual basis. And there's clearly a big increase between 2021 and 2022, and almost all of it is contributed to a reduction in pension expense, where prior year, I believe, pension expense was about $3 million positive, and this year is about 15 million negative. Again, excuse me, that is the direct result of the CalPERS performance, and also changes in proportionate share or the allocation percentages that CalPERS uses. It was actually very significant that we had to create a separate line item for it in the financial statements this year, to make sure that because it was showing like public safety expenses as negative in total and so on. So we actually had to create a separate line item to report pension expense separately because it was so significant.
I'm sorry, I have one more question. I apologize. I thought listening to the prior presentation that 2022 was a bad year for our pension liabilities because the stock market did terribly and their investments were bad. So, and what I'm hearing you say is 2022, we did well. And the reason we did well was because of the pension liabilities. I don't fully understand. Is it possible?
It's just that the financials, yeah, no, of course, no, it's a good observation that the financial statement numbers are 1 year behind. So even though the financial statements is as of June 30, 2022, the pension information were measured as of June 30, 2021. This is usually because CalPERS does not issue actuarial valuations timely, so there's always 1 year lag. So what we're reporting on fiscal year 2022 are really the 2021 numbers or amounts. So this is not unique to Larkspur. This is across the state for all CalPERS participants, that there is this 1 year lag. So when we talk about the 2022 financial statements, we're really talking about the 2021 CalPERS year.
Got it.
and
Thank
the
you for
earnings
explaining that.
They had for that.
Thank you.
And Mr. Badawi, if I can just jump in, just another clarification, speaking of the lag. So on slide 11, you had looked at the capital assets, and I was going to ask at the end, but so I noticed that the 2022 is 86 million and 2021 was 75 million. And I remember from my notes when you were here last year on the 19th, the assets were the Bon Air Bridge. I think that's what did the 7 million jump. And so I'm assuming that was for what had happened in 2020. And now we've completed the bridge. So this jump is for any construction that happened in 2022, right? Or is that correct?
That is correct. So
okay.
the increase from 75 to 86 million, those are constructions during 2022.
And the roads as well. So I think we're finishing up Measure B. So we should see no bridge jump, but we should see a little bit of road jump next year. And in decrease of asset strength, from this year will be reflected next year as well when we do this.
That is correct. As far as I know, the bridge has wind down or pretty much complete. So we don't expect that there will be big increases related to the bridge in the future.
Okay, and just one other thing, when it comes to capital assets, do you factor in depreciation? So for example, this building, are we depreciating this asset and, the fire stations and so forth?
Of course.
Okay.
All assets except land are being depreciated. However, the assets have to be completed and put in service first. So the bridge, for example, the bridge, I guess, is unique treatment based on some previous practices, but in general, when an asset is in construction, it's not being depreciated until it's put in service. And once it's put in service, the depreciation starts.
Okay, thank you. And one last question. So, from a funding, like when we do our consent agenda, there's a whole lot of funding codes. So I'm assuming those all roll up into the graph we're looking at here. So when you say cash and investments or receivables, there's no funding code, for example, that would go through the consent calendar that isn't represented in this kind of a balance sheet.
No, I mean, this is focused on the balance sheet. I want to assume that maybe the funding code has to do with the operating statement, with the revenues and expenditures for the year. But this is really just focused on the balance sheet and what was accumulated over the years.
Okay,
As
fair
of
enough.
a
Thank you.
specific point in time. All right. Okay, so I think I was on slide, I was finishing up slide number 13. And moving on again to this slide, I know this slide, maybe looking at it this year, that it may not make a lot of sense. You can normally what we do here is we compare the net cost of service to tax revenue, and the net cost of service is the cost of running our city departments minus any revenues that those departments bring in on their own, whether it's charges for users or grants or anything of that nature. In 2022, the number is negative because of that big negative pension expense. So that's really the main reason why this number is showing as negative. Otherwise, it would have been consistent to 2021, around the 10 million. So keep in mind that there is a $15 million negative pension expense that is causing that net cost of service to be a negative number. But overall, tax revenues went up during the year. Expenses, again, they were reduced because of that big pension expense swing. If we were to focus on just the general fund and looking at the unrestricted fund balance in the general fund, we compare that to annual expenditures. Basically, the idea is to see how long can the city continue to pay bills if all revenue sources stop coming in and the city is just strictly using fund balance. Of course, the city is in a very healthy financial position. This number is at 14 months. So that's more than a year worth of expenditures that are in the city's general fund balance. Of course, I know that those amounts have already been spoken for and been earmarked for other purposes, but nonetheless, they are not legally restricted. They are under the council control. And that's, of course, is a very healthy financial position to be in. The next few slides will focus on pension and OPEB. And this is a summary of the city's contributions to the pension plan over the last 3 years. So obviously 2020 is when the pension obligation bond proceeds were contributed to CalPERS. And then you can see after that, you're just really contributing the normal cost or what's being earned every year. As far as the city's pension liability, so currently the city have a net pension asset at almost $10 million net pension asset. What I wanted to bring to your attention is that this number is an estimated number that CalPERS estimates using certain assumptions, and one of the most significant assumptions is the discount rate. So currently the city's liability or asset is calculated based on that 7.15% discount rate. For next year, fiscal year 22-23, that discount rate has been lowered to 6.9%. So that will have an impact on the city's pension liability. That, in addition to what Mary Beth spoke about earlier, you're going to go from a 21% investment earnings to a 7.5% investment loss next year. So those two factors will have a significant impact on the city's pension liability or pension asset. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. OPEB is another benefit that the city offered, the retiree medical benefits. So this is the city's contributions over the last 3 years to the pension plan, to the OPEB plan. This is also an estimated number, and discount rate is one of the significant assumptions. So similar to pension, wanted to show you what the number would look like if that discount rate is either increased or decreased by 1%. In addition to the discount rate, the healthcare trend rate is also one of the significant assumptions in estimating the OPEB liability. So I also wanted to show you what the number would be with a 1% increase or decrease. And then finally, the next few slides are just the required communication. On this slide, our responsibility as the independent auditors is to mainly provide an opinion on the city's financial statements, to evaluate internal control over financial reporting, to evaluate the city's compliance with laws and regulations, to ensure that the city's financials are clear and transparent, and to communicate with the city council. Management have responsibilities in this process. Management is ultimately responsible for the financial statements. Management is responsible for establishing and maintaining internal control over financial reporting, making financial records available to us, establishing controls that will prevent and detect fraud, inform us of all known and suspected fraud, comply with laws and regulations, and take corrective action on audit findings. As far as independence, it's really the audit firm responsibility to maintain independence. We evaluate all additional services that we offer the city, like compiling financial statements, for example. We make sure that we put safeguards in place to maintain our independence. We evaluate any relationships that our firm personnel may have with the city, and make sure that if there are any of those relationships, that first they are disclosed, and second, that we remove those individuals from the audit. And we have not identified any. We believe that the audit was performed in the time frame communicated to the city. As for significant accounting and unusual transactions, there were no unusual transactions, but every year there are some new accounting standards. The city have implemented those new standards during the current year. The most significant one was the first one, GASB 87, accounting for leases. So the city has accounted for a few leases as a result of that. Some of the numbers in the financial statements are estimated numbers. So just wanted to bring to your attention or give you some examples of what some of those amounts are. For example, you mentioned depreciation earlier. So the useful life of capital assets, how long an asset would live, is an estimated number. Fair value of investments is an estimate. Pension and OPEB liabilities are estimated numbers as well. Also wanted to highlight to you some of the more significant disclosures in the financial statements. So the note disclosures are the narrative part of the financials, and they do provide some helpful information that will assist the reader in understanding the different composition of the numbers, the risks that some of the investments are exposed to, and compliance with certain debt covenants and so on. So just wanted to highlight to you some of the important notes in the financial statements that does provide some additional helpful information. Pleased to say that we had no difficulties during our audit. We actually had no significant adjustments during our audit as well. That means that after the city closed its books, we did not come up with any material errors that required the city to address its records. So that's a good reflection on the city's closing process. There were no significant risk or exposure that were identified. We normally communicate with legal counsel to confirm outstanding litigations and make sure that they're properly disclosed. We're pleased to say that we had no disagreement with management. We had one control deficiency in internal control of financial reporting, and that's nothing new. It's the written policies and procedures that we would like to see the city documenting in writing how it does things, how it processes transactions and so on, to ensure business continuity, to be able to hold people accountable when processes are not followed, and so on. So that was just one observation. I think other than that, we have obtained representations from management prior to issuance of our report. This is a letter management addressed to us, acknowledging that they have taken responsibility for the financial statements, that they have disclosed to us all known facts, that they have recorded all transactions, and so on. We're not aware that management have consulted with other accounting firms relating to audit matters. Other than our engagement letter and our representation letters, there were no other significant communications with management. There were no material uncertainties relating to events and conditions, and we have not become aware of any instance of fraud or illegal acts. Finally, on this last slide here is a summary of the new accounting standards that are coming your way. Every year we have discussion with management about the new standards, whether they will be applicable to the city or not, and also what the city would need to do to get ready for them. So as we approach them, we will have more and more discussion with management about those. I think other than that, that concludes my presentation. So thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm more than happy to answer any additional questions.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Badawi, for an excellent and thorough report. Any council members have any questions or comments?
I just had, thank you for that. And thank you, Kathy, for, it might be a little preemptively, but in the 2003 new accounting standards, I was trying to look it up on the major report. GAAP GASP statement number 94 would be public-private partnerships. Can you just, is there any highlight you can give us on what that is?
It's usually just documenting relationships with maybe like if you're outsourcing service to some other private organizations and so on. So as far as I know, this is not going to be applicable to the city, but that's usually what it would be covering.
Okay.
My anticipation that probably statement 96 might be applicable to the city. And that
That's
has,
subscription. Okay.
yeah, that's because nowadays a lot of the software are web-based, where the city doesn't really own the applications. They own the right to use it for a number of years. So that we anticipate that will be applicable to a lot of our clients.
If I could just jump in, would the Larkspur Commons be a candidate for number 94? So we have a LLC that might be transferring funds in some manner. I'm not sure if that's something that applies here.
I mean, obviously we'll have to look at those types of arrangements and agreements and make sure that the criteria applies. So that's part of the implementation of any accounting standard, and the discussion with management is talking about those criteria and whether some of those agreements fall within those criteria or not. But I'll have to review it. I can't tell right away whether this is something that will be applicable or not.
That's for next year.
Yeah.
Mr. Mayor, it might be worth just noting, we don't yet actually have a contractual arrangement with the Commons Foundation. And I think before our auditors could really comment on your question, we'll have to enter into an anticipated reimbursement contractual arrangement with the Commons Foundation.
Okay, thank you for that. Any other questions, Councilmember Way or Haroff or Carol? Yes, Kevin, Carol.
If you could go back to slide 25.
Am I still sharing my screen? Can you still see my screen?
No, it's gone.
Oh. Let me try to share it again.
My question was the last item on the page, and that was, you noted no written policy and procedures on the deficiencies in internal control, and I just want to know if that's going to be addressed.
Well,
Are we going to come up
I-
with written policies and procedures?
We do have some policies and procedures, and we are adopted every year with our budget. I believe that our auditors would like to see more of my day-to-day controls of how we do journal entries and how they're who enters them, who's approving them, and who's updating them. There should be some guidelines around cash and cash flow, but it's not like we don't have any written policies and procedures. I know that they would like it to see more about our day-to-day, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ahmed.
No, that is accurate. That is accurate.
But yes, it will be corrected.
Okay.
Great. And if I could just follow up on that, that was also my question. And so Kathy, my understanding is, like, I have the budget book from fiscal year 22-23, and on page 80 is a whole list of policies. So I think that's what you mean, that we do have policies, but the takeaways from last January's audit, I had the same note, we had the same question and in the same remedy. So for this year, maybe more specifically, I don't know if this is, helpful, but what would you say are like the top 3 day-to-day policies that are worth documenting? Because I imagine there's, documenting for the sake of documenting, but some things are really just truly helpful to an auditor, and maybe they might be easier to draft.
cash flow is going to be one, and one of the reasons I haven't addressed that one is because we are implementing Central Square, and so the cash flow that comes from them and how we are dealing with, it's all new. I mean, everything is completely different, and we're still trying to figure out our way. It's so brand new that I was like, well, if I write something, it's going to change. So I thought I'd wait on that one. I do know that journal entries, that's another big one that has, tracks flows. It's a huge piece. I have general guidelines between the three ladies and I that when we do work, whoever's entering does not get to review or approve it. I am the only one that can update any journal entries. It just needs to be put down in paper. So.
Okay. That's really helpful. So my understanding is that journal entries, we had a meeting a long time ago. So you have a online software system that you're using, which I think is highly secure.
Yes.
And it's not about that. It's about the workflow of who's the author, who's the reviewer, and so forth. And that just needs to be put on paper for an editor to know that it exists, but it's being practiced, is I think what you're saying.
Correct.
Okay.
And the same thing with accounts payable. Whoever's entering doesn't get, somebody else is reviewing and approving. So there's always a segregation and somebody else is always looking.
Mhm.
And the same thing, like the bank doesn't allow us to do any wires without two approvals. And we all have to have our little tokens with us. So it's probably well worth writing down that, even though it's regulated by the banking rules and we're regulated, we'd still have to follow a lot of caution procedures for check and balances.
Okay. That's very helpful. Thank you so much. Any other council member questions? And I'm wondering if we need to open this for public comment. Yeah, so maybe there's nobody in the chambers right now. So Allison, if anyone in the public has their hand raised.
I'm looking for any raised hands from our audience members on Zoom. There's no public comment.
Okay, great. So with that, I want to thank Mr. Badawi for every year. I've seen you now a few years in a row, and it's always a great education. And as the city manager said, Kathy, we all really appreciate what you're doing and that you're the results. It looks like you're getting an A+ here. So thank you so much.
So, Mr. Mayor,
Mr. Mayor, do we need a motion to accept?
Yes, we do.
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. So
If so, I'd like to make that motion to accept the audit report.
great. Thank you for that, Kevin. Do we have a second?
I would second that.
All right, we have a motion, a second. If we could get a roll call.
Councilmember Carroll,
Yes.
Councilmember Hara,
Yes.
Councilmember Way,
Yes.
Vice Mayor Kendall,
Yes.
Mayor Paulson.
Yes. Passes unanimously. And again, thank you so much, Kathy and Mr. Badawi and the whole team. So with that, we have one more item for tonight, and I believe that is the committee assignments. First, I want to thank all the council members who were patient with me and let me climb my learning curve this year. And I believe, do we need any report or do we just open this up and see if there's any questions?
This is one of the handful of items that's entirely in your hands, Mr. Mayor.
Oh, wow. Okay, well, all right. So just a couple few comments. I really, tried to reach out to all the council members and wanted to make sure that there was a good distribution. People were, their preferences were honored. It was a new experience. We have a new council member who has more experience than either Scott or I did. And, getting the master list was very helpful, came a little bit late. But I guess all the council members have seen it. I think it's been posted publicly. I suppose what we need is just to have approval. If this is acceptable to everybody, those will be our assignments. And I'm really hopeful that everyone is happy and really ready to do the work because there's so much ahead of us this year. So I guess I'm checking if we need to have a motion and a vote or just a yay or any nays.
Yay.
I'll move approval of 8.2.
Okay, so we have a motion
I'll second that.
and a second. Could we have a roll call, Allison?
My mic may not have been on. Councilmember Carroll,
Yes.
Councilmember Hara,
Yes.
Councilmember Way.
Yes.
Vice Mayor Kendall,
Yes.
Mayor Paulson.
Yes. Thank you. And that takes us to our last item, which is adjournment. So a motion to adjourn. Great. So we are adjourned at 8:26 and we will see you at our next regular meeting on February 1st. Thank you and good night.